I'm pleased to welcome and introduce our second panel. Obviously, all of you were here to hear the first panel as we went through that. We look forward to having your expertise. I'll go ahead and introduce, and as usual, we start out with the most difficult name first. And so Mr. Gentirdi or Dur?
It's phonetic. You can just literally read it out.
Okay, Mr. Coley, how about that? Well, Managing Director of Deloitte Consulting, welcome, thank you. Ms. Diane Katz, Senior Research Fellow in Regulatory Policy at the Heritage Foundation, welcome. Mr. James Goodwin, Senior Policy Analyst at the Center for Progressive Reform, welcome. And Mr. Clyde Wayne Cruz, Jr., the Vice President of Policy and Director of Technology Studies at the Competitive Enterprise Institute, welcome. Pursuant to committee rules, all witnesses will be sworn in before they testify, so if you will please rise and raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? All right, thank you. You may be seated. Let the record reflect that all witnesses answered in the affirmative. And as a reminder, just 5 minutes on your verbal testimony, but your entire written testimony will be made part of the record. And Mr. Coley, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. So you said I work for Deloitte Consulting, and I do, but the reason I'm here is because I served for 4 years as the head of the British Better Regulation Executive, and in that capacity, I led our regulatory reform program for the United Kingdom. So we started that journey in about 2005, and have been going ever since in the United Kingdom. And in the remarks today, I really want to talk about some of the lessons from the British experience, which also reflect experience in other countries. So the UK model has been emulated not just by the UK, but also by other countries in Europe. The Netherlands, Denmark would be some of those countries. Australia, New Zealand, Canada would be others of those countries. And indeed, the concept of one in, two out now acknowledged by the Trump administration is a concept that was invented in London, indeed in the organization I worked for. So with that, let's talk a little bit about the UK experience. So in the period I was responsible for better regulation, serving Prime Minister Tony Blair and then Prime Minister Gordon Brown, we made a commitment to reduce the administrative burden of regulation by 25%. And over that period of time, we took out £3.5 billion pounds of cost from British business. Given that the UK economy is about 7 times smaller than the US economy, and given the UK economy, the pound is a stronger currency, less strong now than it was maybe a year ago or a year and a half ago, but nevertheless a stronger currency, that gives you a sense of the savings. So what are the lessons of that experience? We were very much the pioneers of that, of how to do regulatory reform and how to do it in a sustainable and effective way. So the first lesson that I would say is that you have to focus on the cost of regulations, not the number. Businesses don't care about the number of pages or the number of regulations that are out there. They care about the actual cost that they face. Indeed, they don't really care about the regulation itself. What they care about is the cost imposed by the regulation. So if they don't understand a regulatory requirement and they end up spending more time understanding it, that's a real cost. If, however, a 1,000-page regulation only touches one business in the land and doesn't impose much cost, it's a very minimal cost. So very much the focus in the United Kingdom was to think about real cost on real businesses. And only when we could demonstrate a real cost reduction on real businesses did we count that. So one lesson I would take away is that, and certainly if you look at the administration's one in, two out policy, there are obviously some risks there if you look at just the number of regulations. Secondly, in our experience, it was essential to focus on maintaining protections at the same time as trying to reduce costs. If you were unable to maintain protections, you couldn't get the kind of consensus that you needed in order to drive regulatory improvement. In the UK, we called it better regulation. We didn't call it more regulation. We didn't call it deregulation, and that was a very intentional decision. Our policy was to focus on how are we regulated in order to make it better for the business community, whilst at the same time maintaining protections that are essential for our society. As a result, we focused on simple things, simplifying forms, automating processes. They're the kind of things that yield very significant savings for business and yet are far away from the political limelight and have a real impact. The third lesson, I'd say, is avoid exclusions. A regulatory reform policy can only be effective if it's broad in its coverage. So, for example, if you bring in new controls on immigration and you're committed to a regulatory reform policy, you have to require offsets for those as well. And indeed, one of the members earlier was talking about the risks of exclusions. Of course, you might need some flexibility if the Transportation Security Administration requires limiting liquids going through airport security, as we all know they did. It would have been difficult for them immediately to bring in an offset. But actually, they did bring in offsets later of sorts. They brought in TSA PreCheck, which we know saves people time and money. But maybe if you had an effective regulatory reform policy, might make that happen faster. The fourth thing we learned is this is almost entirely about small businesses. Small businesses are the entrepreneurial engine of the economy, and unlike large organizations which have compliance departments, small businesses' compliance department is the entrepreneur, often at 11 p.m. at night. And so focusing on protecting that small business and supporting that small business to succeed is what we want to do. I spent a lot of time with small businesses, and the thing I heard most of all is we want regulation. We believe in the outcomes that regulation is there for, but we want it to be easier to comply. And so that's where we put our focus. I'm aware of time. The last thing I'd say is fundamentally this is about culture change. What we were trying to do was change the culture of government. And indeed now, with new techniques such as advanced analytics, it's easier to change the culture of government. So regulatory reform for us was about driving sustainable culture change. And indeed, the UK is still on that journey.
Thank you so much. Ms. Katz, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning. As we examine the administration's regulatory reform agenda, I'd like to provide some context about the regulatory landscape that the agenda is intended to reform. But before I even do that, it's driving me crazy. I have to correct an apparent misunderstanding on the part of some members about what these executive orders can and cannot do with respect to
Are you suggesting that members are sometimes confused, Ms. Katz?
Well, I'm not going to go there.
Go ahead.
Under no circumstance can the task forces or agencies summarily get rid of health and safety regulations. If there's a statutory requirement, they're still required to fulfill that. And if they want to change it, they have to go through the same process by which the original rule was created, which is a long, protracted, and very transparent process of rulemaking. Thank you. For the past several years, I and my colleague James Gattuso have tracked the number and cost of new regulation and compiled the data in our annual Red Tape Rising reports. This year's report, by the way, is titled Red Tape Receding. During its 8 years in power, the Obama administration issued more than 23,000 regulations and increased cumulative regulatory costs by more than $122 billion annually. And that's only counting major rules, nor are dozens of rules issued by independent agencies in the tally. That $122 billion figure was nearly double the $68 billion imposed under the administration of President George W. Bush. On the day President Trump took office, his administration inherited some 1,900 actions in the rulemaking pipeline. And as the number of regulations has grown, so too has government spending on administration and enforcement. The pace of new regulation during the Obama years was unparalleled, but regulatory expansion has been occurring for decades under both Democratic and Republican administrations. The need for reform has never been greater, and the Heritage Foundation's 2017 Index of Economic Freedom documents the urgency. For the 9th time in the past 10 years, the U.S. has lost ground compared to other countries. In the business freedom component of the index, which measures the regulatory burden, the U.S. this year registered its lowest score ever. The benefits of reform are numerous and well documented, particularly for lower-income Americans who bear a disproportionate burden from regulation. But progress is hard to come by. As you know, the federal regulatory apparatus is immense, convoluted, and lethargic, and it involves decades of legislative, executive, and judicial edicts. So that means no single reform will be enough to rein it all in. A variety of systemic and strategic reforms are needed, and we should welcome any new approaches. The most important component of any reform proposal is that it focuses our attention and agencies' attention on reform. My written testimony details the administration's reform efforts in its first 6 months, but I'll briefly address EO 13777 and EO 13771. And obviously, everyone here knows what those are. Although agencies are currently required to document that the benefits of a new regulation exceed the costs through a cost-benefit analysis, there's no constraint on the accumulation of new regulatory costs. Regulatory budgeting has the potential to inject some badly needed discipline and rationality into the rulemaking process if its operational challenges can be addressed. The 2-for-1 requirement puts some long-needed muscle behind the multiple but non-binding White House directives for agencies to conduct retrospective review. But there's some practical challenges that may affect these EO's utility, and I detail responses in my written testimony. But suffice it to say that we're at the point in time when we need to do something more than has been done in the past. The administration has taken a very good step in starting. We'll have to see over the long term what it's able to accomplish, but there's also lots that Congress needs to do as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Katz. Mr. Goodwin, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Meadows, Chairman Jordan, Ranking Member Connolly, and Ranking Member Krishnamurthy, and members of the subcommittees. I appreciate the opportunity to testify today on the Trump administration's ill-conceived regulatory reform task forces, their lack of adequate transparency and meaningful public participation, and indeed, whether their efforts to undermine the regulatory safeguards we all depend on should be taking place at all. My prepared testimony for the record makes 3 points. 1, regulations are essential for safeguarding the public. 2, the Trump administration's task forces and the regulatory review processes that they were created to carry out are fundamentally flawed as both a theoretical and practical matter. Their work threatens to do much more harm than good, and this experiment in regulatory reform should be abandoned. 3, given the Trump administration is unlikely to abandon the pillars of his assault on public safeguards, Congress must be vigilant and must conduct vigilant and thorough oversight of the task forces in the work they undertake. I conclude by offering some recommendations on what this oversight might entail. My oral presentation will focus on these latter 2 points. Point 1, the Trump administration's regulatory reform task forces and their work suffer from at least 4 fundamental flaws. 1, the public harms they will create. 2, their lack of a rational policy basis. 3, their continuing disregard of fundamental norms of administrative law. And 4, their intractable implementation problems. Today I will focus my remarks on the task force's disregard of fundamental norms of administrative law. As William Funk, a leading scholar on the subject, has noted, transparency and public accountability are 2 of the essential hallmarks of U.S. administrative law. Fidelity to these principles is essential to ensuring that agencies are dutifully fulfilling the missions that Congress has set out for them in their authorizing statutes. Transparency assists Congress in performing its oversight activities more effectively, while public participation serves as a mechanism for connecting the abstract goals that Congress has articulated in statutes to the practical realities of the world in which the implementing regulations will give life to those goals. Therefore, Congress in particular has an especially strong interest in ensuring that regulatory actors comport with the principles of transparency and public participation, and Congress in particular should be outraged when regulatory actors defy those principles. To this point, the operation of the Trump administration's regulatory reform task forces has been marked by a distinct lack of transparency and balanced public participation, rendering them susceptible to abuse by narrow interests. With regard to transparency, Executive Order 13777 imposes no real mandates on agency task forces to operate in an open manner that would allow for meaningful public accountability or congressional oversight. The order does not mandate that agencies disclose the identity of their task force members. The task forces are not subject to any open meeting requirements. The task forces never need to explain the basis for the recommendations. Indeed, these recommendations never need to be disclosed at all. With regard to public participation, individual agency task forces have taken wildly divergent approaches to seeking public input, suggesting that this process is at best a low priority and at worst window dressing. When agencies did solicit public input, it was debatable whether these opportunities truly offered members of the public a credible avenue for impacting the task force's recommendations. The deadlines for submitting comments were often too short, and these deadlines often fell right before or even after agency task forces were required to submit their initial reports of recommendations. Point 2. Going forward, Congress will have an important role to play in supervising the regulatory reform task forces. I outlined some steps that they should take as part of this. The first step this and other committees should take is to make full use of their oversight and information gathering authorities. The second step Congress should take is to monitor the deregulatory actions the Trump administration is carrying out to ensure that they are complying with applicable procedural safeguards. My prepared testimony outlines several criteria that Congress may wish to use to inform these monitoring efforts. As a third step, this and other relevant committees should commit to taking appropriate and effective responses whenever they identify potential instances of agencies failing to abide by their administrative law responsibilities. As a fourth and final step, this committee may wish to investigate on an ongoing basis other matters of critical importance that are relevant to the work of the Trump administration's task forces, such as the degree to which their work comports with basic administrative law principles such as transparency and balanced public participation. Thank you. I'd be pleased to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you, Mr. Goodwin. Mr. Cruz, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning. I'm Wayne Cruz, Vice President for
If
Policy.
you can pull the mic a little bit closer if it's on there.
Vice President for Policy at the Competitive Enterprise Institute, and I thank the chairman and the members for the invitation to address regulatory reform task forces, 2-for-1 rule pacing, and cost management. These steps reaffirm sound regulatory review and agency engagement, but will best function within a framework of improved congressional accountability for what regulators do. Politics obscures it now, but alongside overseas development like Britain's 1 in 3 out, proposals to monitor regulatory costs have deep bipartisan pedigree. Regulatory budgeting dates back to Jimmy Carter and to Texas Senator Lloyd Bentsen, who became Clinton Treasury Secretary. A modern bipartisan route of Trump's 1 in 2 out is Senator Mark Warner's 2010 pay-go. After Trump's first 9 months, and after OIRA's agency directives to include cost allowances in the upcoming unified agenda, what makes us know the task forces are solid ideas? What successes and weaknesses stand out? Reagan's Executive Order 12291 that kick-started OIRA showed that the pen and phone can expand liberty in terms of stabilizing rule counts and Federal Register pages. Trump's reductions appear to be the most significant since then. Meanwhile, dozens of guidance documents have been rescinded, such as the Labor Department proclamations on franchising and independent contracting. But too much of the regulatory apparatus is beyond OIRA's scope. The core reality is that revoking a rule requires another notice and comment rulemaking progression. And long-term, task force machinery can't overcome presidents who deprioritize oversight. Meanwhile, the 800-pound gorilla independent agencies get no OMB scrutiny, even under Trump's orders. And until Trump's orders, guidance documents, memoranda, and other regulatory dark matter rarely got scrutiny either. Also, task forces must address unmeasured categories of intervention that propel costs, not just discrete rules. When government steers while the market merely rose, that creates compounding costs, even if no budgetable rules get issued, such as the re-embrace of public utility models in the tech and telecom sectors. Rules with cost analysis amount to a small percentage of the rulemaking enterprise. That, along with the administrative state's broader weakening of democratic accountability, only strengthens the case for Congress's restoration of Article I checks and balances. In the meantime, as Naomi Rao advises, Congress doesn't have to wait. It can revoke rules if Trump can't. Other steps include boosting OIRA resources and implementing a bipartisan regulatory improvement commission with goals and targets. As for 2-for-1, it may make sense to emphasize equivalent burdens, perhaps dollar for dollar rather than rule for rule. I highlight also the former U.S. regulatory program, a sister document to the federal budget, and a model by which OIRA could compile annual transparency statistics to better compare apples to apples, to underscore when costs and benefits are not quantified, and to better distinguish between additive and subtractive rules and guidance. At bottom, the benefits sought via regulation are also forms of wealth, and they require market disciplines, not just political ones, to flourish. Markets and competitive enterprise make the world not just richer, but fairer, safer, and cleaner. Regulation doesn't get all the credit. Disagreements over regulatory benefits are the core concern that separate left and right today. These are irreconcilable, but that's actually constructive because it underscores that elected legislators must resolve controversial issues involving regulations with massive impact. But for lesser anxieties, my optimism rests in knowing that some among us agree that sometimes so-called market failures might be rooted in long-standing political failures, and that coercive top-down regulation isn't always the answer. On good days, both the left and right understand regulatory capture and rent-seeking. Until Article I comes to the rescue, here's hoping that today's invigorating savings and streamlining remain permanent changes to the regulatory and guidance landscape. When it comes to economic expansion, you don't have to tell the grass to grow, but you do need to move the rocks off of it. Why not use the new task forces as a lever? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you all for your insightful testimony this morning. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Heiss, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Katz, let me start with you. You implied that members are confused on some issues, so let me pick up on that. I am one of them that you confused in some of your statements there, particularly when you described, in your words, not mine, but that the manner in which regulations come forth is a hard process, a transparent process. From my perspective, it's neither of those. I've run into businesses that are totally unaware that regulations are being formulated. They just wake up one morning and find out there's more regs in their various industry, whatever it is, and they bypass Congress, and all of a sudden we have one legislative body, and that's not agencies. So what is the regulatory process by which they're created?
The Administrative Procedures Act covers most of the rulemaking process, and what I meant by transparency was, and this is the disadvantage to small businesses, is that there are a lot of points along the way in which businesses can offer their comment. Unfortunately, small businesses can't afford the legions of lawyers and lobbyists that big businesses do to keep track of all that's going on in the regulatory space. But there's, the Administrative Procedures Act and the, a variety of other acts and executive orders, do govern a very systematic process of rulemaking. And in some respects, it's too rigid, but it does exist.
I would like to have more information on that, because I see these regulations in essence become law. Businesses have to abide by them. It's law, and there's penalties if they don't. And these are laws that are not created by Congress, and yet they are happening without the jurisdiction and oversight of Congress. To me, that's very problematic. That's not the way our system is designed to operate. But let's move on from here. Let me, Mr. Cruz, let me hit you. In previous attempts from other administrations to retrospectively review regulations, oftentimes that actually resulted in more regulations. What makes this effort different?
You have to have an engaged president, an engaged executive to do it. There were cuts under the Obama administration's retrospective review program, and I think that's important in this debate too, because I heard you mention James Cattuso at the Heritage Foundation. I heard him say that if the Obama administration's retrospective review program was a legal thing to do and an appropriate thing to do, this kind of approach is too. But when President Reagan came in and set up the initial central review process at OIRA, it already pre-existed because of the Paperwork Reduction Act. But that was when there was a focus put on doing cost-benefit analysis of regulations. But the problem is still so many of them are missed, and that's one of the reasons the cost can still go up like you're talking about, because if you're talking about a flow of over 3,500 rules that are going through every year, and then you've got a few hundred that OIRA reviews that are considered significant, then of that, there are some that are major or economically significant. And of those, you end up with just a sliver, a dozen or so, that have cost-benefit analysis at all. And there's a few extras that have cost analysis. So there's a lot that can slip through. And other forms of cost may come in the form of regulatory guidance and things of that sort, because if you mentioned small business and business, you've certainly heard from them on regulatory guidance in recent years too. But I think that's one of the reasons. It takes effort, and it takes setting goals. I think if you try to do regulatory reduction commissions, or if you try to put this kind of regulatory review model in statute, something like that, you've still got to put goals in place so that the regulators know that it's time to trim things. And this is not a partisan issue, too. I mean, when the Regulatory Improvement Commission was debated, I remember a report from the Progressive Policy Institute where they said these rules are stacking up. It's like pebbles in a stream. You drop a little pebble in the stream, and that's fine. But over time, it accumulates. And one of the things that we don't ever do is go through and try to say, well, how much of this makes sense anymore? As I said in my testimony, it's not just regulation that gets you health and safety benefits too. You've got to get those from other areas. You've got to have a lot of forces that array to expand health and safety as well as economic efficiency. So it's too easy for rules to slip through is the essence of it.
Okay, just a yes/no from you, Mr. Coley. The difference. Thank you for being involved in the UK and hear what you did. The differences in our government, will it impact the success of this effort here? The differences between the UK and the US?
The UK not having a separation of powers, the primary difference is around Congress, and the primary difference between the UK and the US is the UK requires regulatory impact analysis for acts by Parliament. The US does not require regulatory impact analysis for acts of Parliament, for acts of Congress.
So can this still work here is my question.
It could. That's definitely a limitation in the US model, but it's a difference.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield.
I thank the gentleman. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Krishnamurthy, again for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If there's one thing my constituents care about, it's effective and efficient government. That is why it's concerning to me to see what the Trump administration is doing, for instance, in the area of health care. It appears that they are actively undermining programs to help my constituents afford quality health insurance. I'd like to ask whether there are legitimate reasons for some of the things that the Trump administration is doing or whether they're just playing politics. Mr. Goodwin, the Trump administration has indicated it will stop necessary cost-sharing subsidies that help Americans afford health insurance. This has required Congress and some of the lawmakers, especially in the Senate, to come up with an agreement to help save health insurance for millions of Americans. And even that plan is at risk of not being able to be passed by the House. Mr. Goodwin, is there a reason other than politics that would explain why the Trump administration is putting the health insurance of millions at risk?
Healthcare is a little outside my wheelhouse, policy-wise, expertise-wise, but I guess I can answer as an interested member of the public, somebody who reads the newspapers. And from my sort of outsider perspective, it does look like playing politics. And I mean, that still should be of grave concern because it really undermines public esteem for our governing institutions when something like healthcare policy, people's healthcare, is being used as a political, or is it being targeted through political games?
Mr. Goodwin, the Trump administration has also issued an emergency rule which would allow any employer to claim an exemption from providing women with birth control under the Affordable Care Act. Mr. Goodwin, is there a reason other than politics that would explain why the Trump administration is putting the health care of millions of women at risk?
Similar answers before. I can't think of a legitimate policy reason, but again, I'm outside of my substantive policy wheelhouse. To me, it looks like playing politics, and that's just as damaging to the institution of the presidency, I think.
And finally, Mr. Goodwin, the Trump administration has announced it will be taking down the healthcare.gov website for quote-unquote maintenance every Sunday morning through the end of the open enrollment period. These morning hours, as you know, are the ideal time for Americans, especially families, to shop for health insurance. And this plan will make it difficult for many Americans to shop for the right health insurance plan for them at times that are convenient for them. Mr. Goodwin, is there any reason other than politics that would explain why the Trump administration is actively sabotaging the efforts of American families to plan for their health care futures?
It doesn't look good, and it really would be great if the Trump administration explained the policy basis for that, because otherwise we're just left with the impression that this is just an ideological-driven action on their part.
Thank you, Mr. Goodwin. I'm disappointed to hear that it appears that the Trump administration is playing politics with the health care of millions of American families. I hope the administration considers doing better by them. Thank you very much.
The chair recognizes himself for a series of questions. Mr. Coley, let me come to you. Where did you see most of the cost reductions in your implementation in the UK?
Across the board, so I would say the largest areas were around occupational health and safety, around employment. We had a big area around so they would be the two largest areas, I would say, off memory, though it's a little bit dated. But again, I just want to emphasize the way in which we did it. So you'd have an agency like our Food Standards Agency responsible for making sure that restaurants followed good food hygiene.
Right.
And they would regularly visit a restaurant establishment and find that the establishment didn't know what to do in order to comply with the law, and so was endangering the people who went to the premises. And so the approach was to give them much clearer guidance, which said, here are the 10 things you need to do. And often small businesses particularly found that extremely helpful in helping them work out what to do, and therefore it was possible for them to reduce costs whilst maintaining protections. That similar approach was used by a number of our agencies. Another thing that was a very important approach was looking at e-enablement. So we were in the relatively early days of the internet as we were starting this, and by taking processes away from complex paper forms and putting them on easy, intuitive, electronic processes, which are where you use design thinking to design the technique in a way that is intuitive for the user, can get rid of all of that time when you're trying to work out what you're meant to do and replace it with time when you're having a seamless transaction. So those kind of things were very, very powerful and were the bulk of the changes that the UK made.
Well, and since many members of Congress love to watch C-SPAN and watch the debating back and forth in a different style than what we're used to here, perhaps you can help me understand when you actually implemented that in the UK. the cost savings, how did that get redirected? Was it redirected somewhere else? Was it actually, I mean, how was it realized?
These are savings for business.
Right.
And we had a very high quality accounting system for a pound of savings. We had to demonstrate it was a genuine saving for business. We then had the numbers validated. We now have an independent committee which validates all those numbers called the Regulatory Policy Committee. And businesses would use that time for things that are different to complying with regulations. So let's take that small business restaurateur. The moment when they're not trying to work out what the rules are, they're using that to think about what should be on the menu next week. So it releases time back into the economy. But the one thing I would say is, we were able to get the support of both the trade union community and consumer groups because our emphasis was absolutely about maintaining protections. And our emphasis was not about, reducing air quality or reducing worker safety or anything like that. It was all about maintaining protections and looking for places where you could streamline the process. And indeed, one of your colleagues talked about how businesses sometimes find it hard to learn about new regulations. We had a review around small businesses and guidance, and somebody said to me, we had a small business person lead that review, and she said, have you ever bought an electronic device, like a television? I said, yes. And she said, when you buy one, you get a quick start guide, which tells you what you need to do when you set up the TV. Yes, you get the 100-page manual, but you also get the quick start guide. And she said, where's your quick start guide for regulation? And that was an incredibly powerful insight, and one that, allowed us to think about new ways to do that. So within a relatively short period, we were setting up quick start guides for every new regulation. Another thing we did in the UK is almost all regulations come into force on 2 days of the year. And so they either come into force in April or in October. And so while there may be a number coming into force, because they're all coming into force on the same day, it's easier for business to get used to it. Whereas if you have them coming in every month, these are very easy things to do that do not impact on protections but have real impact. But they're a long, long way from the sort of political dialogue. And the last thing I'd say is our approach was highly technocratic. It was about technically boring things that made a difference in the real world.
Well, thank you. So I'm running low on time. We'll have a second round where we'll be able to follow up with some of the rest of you. So let me finish very quickly, Mr. Coley. Would you say that this type of regulatory process, where we're actually reviewing and removing regulations, should be a long-term process or more of a spring cleaning kind of once-a-year event that we go in and review it?
Certainly the experience of other countries, the United Kingdom, Australia, Netherlands, etc., has been that introducing long-term disciplines is very, very important, in the same way that long-term disciplines around high-quality cost-benefit analysis, which a number of my colleagues talked about on the panel, is important. Always thinking about ways to maintain protections whilst streamlining is a good thing as well.
So long-term?
Yes.
All right. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from the District of Columbia, Ms. Eleanor Holmes Norton.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Long before I came to Congress, I chaired the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission and had the experience of dealing with regulations and guidelines. And so I'll preface my question by indicating to you, in light of the high profile of sexual harassment in today's headlines, that the Commission studied what were then a few court decisions, district court decisions, indicating that sexual harassment was a violation of an anti-discrimination act. And it had not been so declared. When we did so, of course, we put the guidelines out for comment, but I did something that may be fairly unusual, and I wish we'd done more often today. Obviously, business did not want any kind of regulations of any kind, and I've never heard of a business testifying in favor of regulations. But I called in the leaders of the Business Roundtable and other such business groups and indicated what we had seen happen, that essentially It looked like courts were opening them to liability, and that the government agency had given them no indication of what in the world sexual harassment was. There's a broad statute, it didn't put sexual harassment in it, and so employers didn't even know what to tell their managers about how to handle this very delicate problem. So we got to call them in. And I said, I know you don't want to see any regulation, but if you do not even know what sexual harassment is, how can you be protected against sexual harassment? So you can talk about regulations all you want to, but I had a good conversation at that time with the business community and got their input personally about how they had handled sexual harassment. And I must tell you, some of what had hit the newspapers would make anyone bow their head. I give you that experience because I had to cope with what regulations, guidelines that had never been defined. And by the way, the Supreme Court went on to find that the guidelines were constitutional, and I believe the guidance has been helpful to business, as opposed to being left out there with nothing said. Now, therefore, it seems to me, when I went beyond notice and comment, but actually had the business leaders to come in and see me, I have valued transparency, and because we did accept many changes that could only come from them, that experience with chairing an administrative agency has led me to understand how important transparency is, instead of just being a word that everyone will always buy into. So I'm interested in these task forces. The public will be interested in these task forces. Do any of you know whether or not these task forces consist of career civil servants or, for example, appointees? Does anybody know that? Yes, Mr. Cruz.
In the panel this morning, the indication seemed to be that the majority a lot of the members were career employees. But other than that, I don't know. That's what I'd heard in prior reports as well, and I think that's probably true. But I thank you for the comments on guidelines. It's very, very interesting, the distinctions between regulations and guidances and what role the regulators take and what role Congress takes.
Well, the guidelines were no different in the long run to regulations, because the Supreme Court, in defining what was sexual harassment, used the guidelines and said that what the agency had found was, in fact, the definition from here on in. And so you go to the Supreme Court today, you will find those guidelines used. But the importance of the guidelines, as far as I was concerned, is it told business what was a violation in the first place. So the transparency is very important, it seems to me, to all of us. And Mr. Goodwin, you've heard Mr. Cruz say that he thought that these were primarily career civil servants, and we understand career civil servants operate under the guidance of appointees, but it was reassuring to hear that he believes they were career civil servants who then, of course, would have to convince the appointee. But what is your view of who should be on these task forces?
Well, I was encouraged, too, by the fact that there's so many career employees on that, on these task forces. The first question that sprung to mind for me today was, why am I just hearing about this for the first time today? I didn't know anything about these task forces, for the most part, the identity of the membership until today. So congratulations to this committee for extracting that information. But this is something I've been tracking for a long time, and I know a lot of people have. So it's a little disappointing that we're just now learning basic stuff about these task forces, which are evidently so important and having such a crucial, or making such a crucial contribution to the Trump administration's domestic policy agenda. So I would note that. And the other thing I would note is I hear so much about how the deep state at these agencies and how they're just sabotaging everything the Trump administration is doing. And then one by one, all these agency representatives said that, no, that's not the case at all. These people are professionals. They're given a task and they do it well. And I share the chairman in applauding them for that. I think that's great, and I think it reflects really well on the public servants in our agencies, and I hope we all learn something from that.
Well, do you think, for example, we ought to at least know the agenda of the task forces so as to know which kinds of regulations they are focusing on, so that we know, for example, whether they're focusing on outdated regulations? Of course, regulations have to be updated, or life-saving ones. Is there any agenda published so that the public would know which they're focusing on? Ms. Katz?
I can't say whether the agendas themselves are published. I can say, though, that if the task forces recommend to the agency that there be changes to particular rules, that the agency does have to open a docket, if you will, and take public comment on changing that regulation. In other words, you have to create a regulation to get up to end a regulation, and that's the process I was referring to earlier in terms of there being a formal process.
Well, there's already in place something from OMB for cost-benefit analysis. Mr. Goodwin, are there difficulties in doing a cost-benefit analysis that everybody could agree upon as objective?
Well, I think what we're learning from the cost-benefit analyses on these rules that are being rolled back under the Trump administration is that any sort of claim to credibility or objectivity that cost-benefit analysis may have had has been thrown out the window with these cost-benefit analyses.
Is there an objective way to do cost-benefit analysis?
I mean, there is, unless you are trying to support a decision made by other means, and I think that's what we're seeing with these cost-benefit analyses. If they were to do an honest cost-benefit analysis for these regulatory rollbacks, frankly, the rollbacks would look terrible as an economic matter. And that's why, for example, at the EPA, the Trump administration and Administrator Pruitt put out these really fuzzy cost-benefit analyses where, problematic data, assumptions, accounting tricks, kind of iffy accounting tricks were used to justify these decisions that under any reasonable application of cost-benefit analysis would not pass a cost-benefit analysis test.
Mr. Chairman, if I may ask a final question here. I'm really only looking for, Ms. Katz testified that, at such point as I suppose you were saying, Ms. Katz, that the task forces had a change that they wanted the agency to make. At that point, there would be some transparency. Was that your testimony?
The task forces only make recommendations to the agency. They don't carry out.
Well, see, that's important. So how are they to make recommendations without being identified so that they could receive some input from the public?
I do believe they get some input from the public.
But we don't even know who they are. How do they, at the regulatory stage, you have to have input from the public, but then you're making a recommendation to, let's say, the head of the agency, but you've had no input from the public at that point, though you are making a recommendation for changes in the regulations.
Yes, and these are experts who are making these recommendations, but I suppose it's up to every agency how much input they want to get on their internal recommendations. But as soon as there's any, action involved, then public input is immediate.
Mr. Cruz, did you want to say something on that?
Just a quick thing. I think it's important to point out that I think the agencies of their own accord could have undertaken these kinds of task forces on their own. It didn't have to come from a presidential executive
I think that's an important point.
Right, and so we have to agree that a president, because remember, these are executive agencies, not the independent agencies. We have to agree that the president has some authority in setting his own regulatory agenda.
He certainly does, and he wants as much information as he can get.
Yeah, but Diane's right. It could have been done without an executive order, so that's one thing. So you would know it's going to be internal people within.
Well, we're not questioning the legality of the task forces.
A lot of the questions seem to be, I think.
Well, I think you can rely on whoever you want to on your staff. It's the transparency question for me. The notion that
it comes out in the notice and comment. That's, I think,
but these people have already made a recommendation. Look, as when I chaired the EOC, I didn't. I was dependent upon staff.
Right.
The earlier I had some notion of whether business would think this is the worst thing in the world, the better off I was. And I'm asking whether or not early consultation with the public would be facilitated if the task forces asked for some information from the public or from experts, and if we knew who they were, instead of making them look like they're part of some kind of deep state that nobody knows anything about ever, because we don't know anything, we don't even know what they do until the agency head.
I hear what you're saying. I think that's where things are headed. I think that's the trajectory. You might remember a couple of weeks ago now, there was a day of, it was October 2nd, Vice President Pence gave a speech at the White House, and then after that there were breakout sessions across the various agencies. I went to one of them, and what the key point is that they are looking for comment from the public. And it's
the task forces.
It wasn't the task forces. This was the breakout sessions from the agencies, which you would imagine would have to include and be a part of the task forces, because a lot of the theme of all of this was the executive orders and taking another look at regulation. So part of that ethos was getting input from the public. So I think that's where it's all headed. And ultimately, whatever is put together in the docket would have to go through public notice and comment anyway, because you can't get rid of a regulation, you can only replace it.
Finally, I understand that, but I think
the chair is going to give a generous 8 minutes here, so go ahead, your final question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You're a good friend, but you do understand I'm holding up the fort by myself on this side of the table,
and using everyone's time that's not here. But go ahead, last question.
And they have ceded to me, if that helps. Yeah, and I appreciate your generosity. What I'm really saying is that, and I'm going from my own experience, I didn't have a sense of how I knew business was on the spot, because there could be liability if, in fact, they were sued. I knew they didn't like regulations, so I had my own staff, even before I called them, to consult with business so that I would not, in fact, in the first instance, be issuing guidelines that would send them up the wall. What I value so much, Mr. Chairman, is that you have opened up for us the notion of these task forces that we knew nothing about. And Mr. Cruz, I appreciate what you said, because I hope the chairman heard what Mr. Cruz said, that he felt we were headed toward more input for the task forces themselves from the public, so that by the time they got to the agency level, their own recommendations would have more credibility, because somehow or the other the public had been business, to be sure, and the public had been asked their advice, maybe not on any final regulation, but at least on what the task force was undertaking. So I appreciate, Mr. Cruz, your notion that you think they were headed in that direction. And I thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentlewoman. The chair recognizes himself for a series of questions. Ms. Katz, I want to come back to you, because you've made it very clear that this is an open and transparent process when it comes to actually, I think you said you need to set up a regulation to do away with a regulation. I think what you meant is you need to set up a rule to do away with a regulation, which requires the same comment period as we do that. And you're in my wheelhouse now. This is what I live for. And so at this point, if we're actually going to do away with the rules and regulations and guidance, is there not a noticing period that's required under federal statute anytime that we're going to have to adjust that? Is there something that's required?
For most rules, there would be.
What about guidance?
I'm sorry?
What about guidance?
Well, guidance, Yeah, I may need your help on this. I don't know if guidance has to go through a rulemaking procedure.
All right, so now you're really hitting in my area because the gentlewoman made a good point. Is many times guidance is viewed just as strongly as rules and regulations. In fact, we've found that a lot of times administrations get around the rulemaking process by offering guidance that carries essentially the enforcement of law, but maybe not the enforcement of law, depending on how it gets litigated. So do you see a problem?
Mr. Chairman, if I could just use a second of your time to say
well, you've used a second of everybody else's time, so why not? Go ahead.
That the guidelines I speak of did not have to go through the rulemaking process, and I deliberately put them through the rulemaking process.
Kudos to you. Ms. Katz.
Some guidance are reviewed by the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, but
ORIRA.
There are some that don't, and I think the exchange with Mr. Heisen and I, what I had meant when I referred to transparency and openness was proper rulemaking. So I just want to correct that. But that being said, the other real loophole here is on independent agencies. And this is particularly problematic because since it's 2010 and Dodd-Frank, hundreds, if not thousands, of very costly and burdensome regulations have come through these independent agencies. They're the ones who are getting a free pass here, and that's another problem.
And so your premise is that they should not get a free pass?
They should not get a free pass.
Okay. Mr. Cruz, would you agree with that?
I would agree they should not get a free pass.
Okay.
The independent agencies are heavy, heavy regulators, and it had been the case that economic regulation in the U.S. was declining and environmental regulation was rising. But in recent years, after Dodd-Frank and in the healthcare legislation and now net neutrality legislation and regulation and things of that sort, economic regulation is trickling up, but the agencies can issue guidance rather than issue rules. Another piece of guidance that was a huge guidance was the Waters of the United States rule. That had actually started out as guidance, and like you, they went through and did notice and comment on that. Yeah. But there are many, many economically significant pieces of guidance, but there are thousands of secondary guidances out there that kind of slip through the cracks, and they go through all kinds. There are guidance, memoranda, notices, circulars, bulletins, administrative interpretations. It's a whole word salad of these, and they're not taken into account in the notice and comment process, and they really can, the agencies can really slip aside and use guidances instead. So it's something you have to watch as you do a 2-for-1 or any kind of reg reform campaign.
So, Mr. Goodwin, would you agree with Ms. Katz and Mr. Cruz that they should be included in the review process?
What? In centralized? No, absolutely not.
Why is that? Because you're all about transparency, and all of a sudden now you're disagreeing with your two colleagues on the left and right.
Well, I reject the premise that OIRA is transparent to begin with.
So you think OIRA should be done away with?
Yeah, absolutely. And
why is that? Because
it adds nothing of value to the rulemaking process.
And what quantitative analysis would you suggest that it adds nothing?
I mean,
what studies, what quantitative analysis would you've been here, and I get a little frustrated, Mr. Goodwin, because you act like you don't know what's going on. You're an expert witness. You act like all of this is new information, and actually there's been online portals with the task force and so forth, and you're opining on what is and what is not accurate. So what quantitative analysis do you have to support that OIRA should be done away with?
I don't know if quantitative analysis is necessary.
So you just have your opinion?
No, I have several examples of rules that were weakened as a result of the rulemaking process.
And which ones would those be?
The EPA's coal ash rule.
So would you agree with WOTUS's rulemaking guidance to rulemaking analysis with regards to how OIRA was involved in that? Do you agree with that? You're an EPA lawyer, right? So you probably are well informed on that.
I'm not sure what you're asking me about. There was a WOTUS guidance, which Mr. Cruz was talking about, which did undergo OIRA review. There was the original WOTUS rule, which underwent 2 OIRA reviews.
Right.
And now there's
So where did they go wrong on that?
On the WOTUS rule itself?
Yeah.
It could have been stronger, I think.
Okay, so let me go back to something. You've been talking about how the budgetary analysis that the Trump administration has done is bogus. You didn't use the word bogus, but you questioned its validity under the Trump administration on some of this rulemaking rollback. Is that correct?
You mean the cost-benefit analysis?
Yes.
Yeah.
All right. And so which cost-benefit analysis are you referring to?
The two that I have in mind is the Waters of the U.S. repeal and the Clean Power.
So what quantitative analysis do you get now? Now you're in my wheelhouse again, and if
okay.
I know you're a moot quarter, and so if you want to debate it back and forth, I'll be glad to debate this. So in what quantitative analysis would you suggest that was wrong? Are you an economist?
No.
Are you? Do you have a degree in statistics?
No, I have a master's in public policy. And
okay, what about comparative analysis?
To the extent that that's incorporated.
So, Mr. Goodwin, you're an expert witness here, and you're making statements, sworn testimony. I guess based on what analysis are you suggesting that those were quantitatively incorrect?
Well, I mean, my own assessment of them, as well as the assessment of other experts on them, including folks at NRDC, the Resources for the Future, all kinds of folks who have looked at these things. And we all agree that these, researcher at a PhD economist at Harvard.
You're giving credentials, you're not giving quantitative analysis. What quantitative analysis
for example,
would
with
you
the Waters,
suggest to support your testimony here?
For example, with the Waters of the United States rule, the repeal by the Trump administration, they took the one large category of benefits that they could find, the protection of wetlands, and they just zeroed it out based on some pretty flimsy
pretty flimsy according to you?
No, according to everybody who's looked at it.
Everybody? Well, not according to me. I can tell you I'm not in the everybody. Ms. Katz, were you part of that? Did you think it was bogus? Okay.
Okay,
so,
everybody...
Mr. Goodwin, my point is, when you make statements, you need to back them up with proof. And so let's go under the previous administration. Were there any of their analysis, cost-benefit analysis, that was incorrect?
Yeah.
On which ones?
Off the top of my head, the coal ash rule that I just mentioned before.
So you're saying that they made the wrong analysis on implementing coal ash? That may make headlines.
The cost-benefit analysis, yeah.
So you said it would actually benefit us a lot more? Is that what you're saying? I'm trying to figure out where you're coming from on this.
It's been a while since I looked at it, but the rule itself was stronger than during the OIRA process. It was weakened, and part of the process for weakening it was, or part of the justification for weakening it was a cost-benefit analysis that was flawed, yes.
Okay. So can you get to this committee, your analysis on where the Trump administration has gone wrong on the cost-benefit analysis?
Sure.
Your personal.
Oh, yeah, sure, and it's cited in my, testimony as well.
So you're saying today is the first day that you really understood anything about the makeup or the input from these task force. Today is the first day. That's your sworn testimony.
I know very little about what was in these things beyond, I think a New York Times report was all I ever really saw of.
But I thought you were the expert witness here today.
How can I be an expert on something that's not transparent?
Well, but it is. I would say that I had my staff look up. I said, certainly this has to be transparent. And there's actually online portals at DOD, Commerce, Interior, and other agencies already. And you're the expert, and yet you don't know about those online portals and the request for information?
Oh, I saw the Department of Interior one. All it did was...
But I thought today was your first day that you found out about it.
No. I said the membership...
That was your sworn testimony.
No, I said today was the first day I knew about the membership of the task forces and who those individuals were.
So are the task forces a good thing or a bad thing?
No, they're a bad thing.
And you base that on
I
what?
identify 4 flaws in my testimony.
In terms of... so it's a bad thing based on... Well, I thought, according to you, I got a quote from you that basically said that you didn't think that this deregulation executive order was really amounted to anything. Because according to you, it was like a bumper sticker or a stump speech, something that is hard to be translated into regulatory policy, but we're hearing today it's actually been translated into regulatory policy, and it's actually saved millions of dollars. So would you revise that statement?
Well, $22 million, which according to my calculations is 7 cents per American.
So what you're saying is because it's only $22 million, that's not a big deal?
No, I'm just saying it's not as there's you know, to the extent that so what we heard today from the first
is $22 million a big deal?
It's not as big a deal as people are making it out to be. And here's the important thing.
Here's the important thing. No, that's not an important thing. I think at this particular point, you know, what I'm seeing is we've asked a host of people to come here from an expert witness standpoint. What I got from you was disappointing, Mr. Goodwin, because what it came in was with more rhetoric on what you thought with perhaps an agenda. Actually, since you mentioned the Times article, they just passed me a note. The Times article that you referred to actually included many of the names of the task force members, so maybe you didn't read it.
No, I did. That's what I said. Is to the extent that I knew anything about the membership, it was from that article.
Okay. Here's what I want the message to go away with. I want to thank each one of you for your testimony. Mr. Coley, thank you for giving us a good model of which actually we saw it implemented in the UK and how it's making a difference. Mr. Goodwin, you know, I come back to you and say that perhaps we can look at this in a more open way from a cost-benefit analysis, and I'll be glad to work with you in the future looking at it from a different perspective. Ms. Katz, Mr. Cruz, thank you so much for your expert testimony in terms of what it's doing. Mr. Goodwin, I would disagree with you from a standpoint of the value of OIRA. Under the previous administration and under this administration, I think they perform a critical role. And to suggest otherwise really makes me question really your testimony from an administrative procedures point of view. I mean, again, you're in my wheelhouse, and I'll be glad to follow up. If you want to come by my office, my door is always open. Be glad to do that. But here's the concern I have. This is saving real dollars for the American people. And you may not think $22 million is a lot, but I think it's a whole lot. And every dollar, whether it's 7 cents or not, is money that can be directed towards other things. And it's critically important. And I think what we ought to do is applaud these task force and the efforts that's there. It shouldn't be a spring cleaning kind of event, Mr. Coley. It should be an ongoing event. And as we look at that, to try to implement this across the board. If there is no further business before the subcommittees stand adjourned.